Okay, I'm going to talk about cannibalism. Now, I'm not speaking strictly about, a human eating another human or a species eating the same species, but kind of indirectly I am, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, let's start at the beginning. So if we imagine a single-celled organism, okay, and this is the only single-celled organism, okay, there are no other life forms except this single-celled organism. So, one species, and this species, let's say that it gets energy from sunlight, okay, so through photosynthesis or whatever. Now, this single-celled organism is going to replicate, right? It's going to replicate and replicate until eventually there's a ton of this single-celled organism. And what happens after there are so many of these single-celled organisms is eventually there's so many of them that the top layer is literally going to block the sunlight out from the bottom layer, okay? And in effect, that bottom layer is not going to be able to get sunlight, and the bottom layer is going to die, all right? So we can think about this in the same way you think about a forest, right? So like we have these giant trees and the canopies are, 100 feet in the air, and all the undergrowth has basically, it's evolved to use less sunlight and still thrive, right? But it wasn't always like that. So if we go back to the single-celled organism example, again, this bottom layer is dying off. Well, there's a middle layer, right? The layer above the bottom layer and below the top layer. This layer is going to meet the same fate as the bottom layer unless it evolves, okay? And how does it evolve? Well, it evolves first by eating the bottom layer, right? It eats the bottom layer, and instead of getting all of its energy directly from the sunlight, it evolves to eat the dead organic matter from the bottom layer. And the end result of this eventually is that bottom layer and middle layer will kind of mesh, right? And it will evolve to eat the top layer directly. It'll evolve to eat live organic matter and then perhaps dominate even the top layer, right? And it'll all kind of mesh together again. So we have this middle layer that first evolves to feed on the dead organic matter, okay, the easy energy, and then it evolves to feed on the top layer. And if you think about a forest again, you can think about, first you have this undergrowth that evolves to get more nutrients from the soil and depend less on sunlight, and then eventually there's bugs that evolve to feed even on the top layer, on the canopy, or whatever, monkeys that eat the fruit from the trees, right? The point is that when this middle layer started eating the bottom layer, it was sort of a form of cannibalism, right? It was eating its own species, but it was dead, right? It was eating its own dead species. And then it evolves to eat the top layer, okay? And at this point, it can kind of be considered a different species, right? Because it's getting energy from a different source. So let's make this analogy and swap. Let's make an analogy and swap this whole concept over to economics, okay? And the human condition in general. So what do I mean by economics? Well, this top, middle, and bottom layer, we're now going to equate to the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. So when the upper class, it blocks all the sunlight, blocks all the energy, right, all the necessities and the money, and it hogs it all, and that upper class thrives, right? And then the lower class dies, right? And then what happens first? Well, at first, the middle class, it feeds on the easy energy, right? It feeds on that lower class. And where do you see this? You see this when everyday middle-class Americans, where was the phone that you're watching this video on made? It was made by some slave labor in some third world country, right? Where did the silicon come from? The point is we are literally cannibalizing the lower class, and eventually the upper class will still continue to hog all of the energy, and eventually this middle class and lower class will mesh together, and the end result will be we evolve to feed on the upper class. Okay, so right now the upper class, they're dominating, they're taking all the energy, they're effectively cannibalizing the consciousness of the middle and lower class. Now, what do I mean by the consciousness? Well, the upper class, the ruling class, they manipulate us, right? And they manipulate us by dominating our consciousness with, you know, media and these divide and conquer strategies, right? They turn us again, they turn the middle and lower class against each other. They manipulate us. But eventually we realize that we are the middle and lower class. Eventually we team up. Eventually we evolve. And eventually we flip the script of that cannibalism of consciousness. And what that looks like is we end up taking the true value of our labor back. We end up ending that exploitation of labor that is driven by the upper class. This comes through the form of class consciousness. When the middle and lower class stop being divided by the upper class's cannibalism of our consciousness, you know, again, they cannibalize that consciousness by literally manipulating us to, in effect, divide the middle and lower class against themselves, rather than the true enemy, who is that top layer, who is eating us, right? It's a kind of a weird analogy, but again, this is how nature works. This is how nature evolves. If one species becomes too dominant, the species will end up cannibalizing itself, and that will lead to a higher diversity of species. So you could literally think of the middle and lower class as a different species as the upper class. And I mean that, because we evolve differently. We live very different lives. A lot of people like to say that humans aren't evolving anymore. Okay, that's garbage. Okay, the fact of the matter is that your brain, your conscious thoughts, allow you to evolve much faster than the traditional evolution that you think of. And the way that comes, the way we evolve, is through communication, right? And if we allow the upper class to, again, cannibalize our communication by controlling it from these, you know, these mainstream media platforms, we effectively become eaten by that ruling class, right? But the inevitability, it is inevitable, however, that the middle and lower class will flip this script, will flip this cannibalism back on the ruling class. It is just the law of nature. There's nothing that can be done to stop it. And again, maybe a few of those lucky ruling class, maybe they'll escape this cannibalism, but by and large, it's going to come for all of them. And it also, you know, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage between the middle and lower class if we're not careful. The point is we need to raise class consciousness, and we do that effectively by evolving and flipping the script and cannibalizing the upper class's consciousness. We need to manipulate them to understand that there's two paths we can go down. We either literally physically eat them, maybe not physically, but we take what they have to survive, because that's what you have to do to survive, or we do it peacefully. And I prefer the peaceful option. I think we can all just kind of ease this back to center. We can all live in harmony if we try hard enough. But if the ruling class keeps manipulating us, if they keep cannibalizing our thoughts, literally, if they keep dominating our thoughts in the mainstream media, then eventually it's going to backfire in a revolutionary-esque manner. We don't want that, and nobody wants that. Again, there's a lot of collateral damage that occurs if you go down that path. So, again, this bottom layer, we're feeding on it, okay? And if you're part of the middle class in the United States, or even the lower class in the United States, you're probably feeding on an even lower class that's in some third world country. You're feeding on that bottom layer. And if you continue to allow that ruling class to dominate, to exploit your labor, and to, in effect, control your consciousness, to cannibalize your consciousness, then that ruling class eventually is going to push you down into the bottom layer. That is how this works, okay? You have to understand the diversity of nature, and if you don't, we're going to run into some problems. Speaking of diversity, okay, so just give that a little thought. Thanks for watching.